Look, so I shall start. So hello, everyone. Welcome to our Restraints and Seclusions in Vermont Schools, What Rule 4500 Means for You and Your Child workshop today. All of our workshops, including previous ones, are recorded and can be watched on our VFN YouTube channel. The link is on our website, which is vermontfamilynetwork.org. Everyone who registered for today's workshop will receive a follow-up email with a link to this recording and a PDF of the presentation with live links. Vermont Family Network has been serving families of children with special health needs and disabilities, and the professionals who serve them for more than 30 years. We are the federally designated Parent Training and Information Center, the Family to Family Health Information Center, and the Vermont chapter of both Family Voices and Parent to Parent USA. Today's workshop is being recorded. This session will include live captions. If you wish to turn them on, click on Live Transcript, then Show Subtitles. If you're comfortable, you are welcome to turn on your camera. Because this workshop covers a lot of content, participants will be muted. Please ask questions using the chat function. Because we anticipate the workshop might run beyond 2 p.m., Tracy will stop presenting at 1:50 to answer questions before resuming to finish the rest of her material. Feel free to share information or links to resources you found helpful in chat as well. We know we can all learn a lot from each other. As a reminder, this is not the forum to discuss individual children, schools, or incidents. If you have specific questions, you are of course welcome to contact us at BFN or Tracy at the Agency of Education about those situations. I'm excited to introduce you to Tracy Harris, Coordinator for Social, Emotional, and Behavioral Supports at the Vermont Agency of Education. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Karen. And I also wanted to introduce my colleague, Kate Anderson, who is relatively new to the Agency of Education, and she has recently come on board to join me in the Rule 4500 Restraint and Seclusion work. So I'm excited about that, and this is her first webinar. So welcome, Kate. Kate is with our multi-tiered systems of support team. So as Karen mentioned, I have a lot to cover, and I know I won't get through it all, and I'm just hesitant to cut back because I truly believe that by using scenarios and asking questions about those scenarios, I believe that's the best teaching tool, but that takes time. So I don't want to cut those. So as Karen said, we'll stop 10 minutes before 2 o'clock. And then for those of you that are able to stay and want to stay, we'll continue after that. And those of you who can't stay, it'll be recorded and archived. Okay, without further ado, next slide, please. This is just an overview of what I plan to cover. And what I hope for is that we will get through everything in the left-hand column, and then I hope by 1:50 we will have covered prohibited interventions. The last 3 things are the more cut and dry sort of parts of the rule, kind of dry, but I will cover those nonetheless after we've taken questions. Next slide, please. So the purpose of Rule 4500 is to create and maintain positive and safe learning environments. It's also in place to promote the use of positive behavioral supports and interventions, of which restraint and seclusion is not. So the goal is to use positive behavior interventions and supports, and to only use restraint and seclusion as an emergency intervention and of last resort. Most importantly, to me anyway, it is in place to ensure that students are not subjected to inappropriate uses of rules and restraint. That's why we have a set of regulations around them. Next slide, please. Here's the overarching thing, and you're going to hear me repeat this so many times you'll be sick of me, probably 10 minutes into it. But it's important, and if there's nothing else that you get from this presentation, then this is what I want you to know. Restraints and seclusions are considered emergency interventions, not planned interventions, emergency interventions, to be used only as a last resort and only when a student poses an imminent threat of substantial physical harm. I'm going to dissect every one of those terms, but that's the catchphrase there, and it's an important one. Next slide. We're going to go into definitions, and I am going to spend some time on this because there's just a lot of misconception out there about what is what. So the first definition, next slide, please, is escort. So an escort is a temporary touching or holding without the use of force of the hand, wrist, arm, shoulder, back of a student, and of a student who's exhibiting minimal resistance. And it's used for the purpose of just directing movement from one place to another, just how you would, you know, a friendly pat on the back saying, come on, it's time to go, just like that. That's an escort. It can represent a momentary period of person-to-person contact accomplished with the minimal force necessary, like you might do with a toddler, you know, just a little bit more directive. And that is used to prevent a student from completing an act that could result in potential harm for themselves or others. But again, it's only minimal force and the child is not resisting. So with that definition of an escort, those are allowable outside of Rule 4500. They don't represent a restraint or seclusion or a restraint. They could be used by any teacher in the school building, unless of course the student's plan says don't touch this kid. Next slide, please. The next thing, so to contrast that, is what I call a moving restraint, but some people call these transfers, and some people do call this escort. So there's some semantics at play here, but a moving restraint is more than just the minimal amount of restriction for a brief period of time. It is used when a child is actively physically resisting moving. The purpose is to move the child to a safer or more private location. And because this is a form of restraint, remember, we're only going to do that as a last resort. So that sort of moving restraint is considered a restraint, and it is governed by Rule 4500. Those sort of moving restraints can only be used by using specific techniques trained through a program that's been approved by the Vermont AOE. Some of those programs don't advise that you use moving restraints because it can be more dangerous if you're trying to hold a kid who is thrashing and kicking and squirming around and trying to walk all at the same time. So some training programs allow them, others don't. Next slide, please. All right, a physical restraint is the use of physical force to prevent an imminent, substantial risk of bodily harm. Nothing more, nothing less. It's the use of force. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. We are putting our hands on kids. This is a serious thing. This is only used in emergencies. We are physically forcing the child or restricting their movement. want to make special note to talk about supine and prone restraints. Supine restraints are when the child is lying on the floor, being held on the floor, face up on their back. That's a more restrictive type of hold. And in Vermont, that type of hold is prohibited, except when the student's size or the severity of their behavior requires it, or if you've already tried a less restrictive type of hold and the kid is still being unsafe. So those are the only times when you could use it. Prone restraint, same thing, except the child is lying face down on the floor on their stomach. That is the most restrictive type of hold. It's also prohibited, except under the instances that I just described. And the reason that these are prohibited are because they're the most dangerous ones. Anytime we put our hands on a child, we risk injuring them or us. Anytime we put a child on the floor and hold them, there is a risk of, it's called positional asphyxiation, meaning that they may have restricted breathing. They may have trouble breathing if their movements are limited. Okay, next slide, please. Here's our first scenario. I'm going to tell you about Zola, and then I want you to, when I'm done describing this scenario, I would like you to type into the chat box whether you think that the intervention being used is a restraint, a moving restraint, or an escort. All right, so Zola was asked to step in the hallway to talk with her behavior interventionist because she had just thrown a metal water bottle at a classmate. Zola refused and sat in her seat. The BI placed a hand on Zola's back and spoke quietly, encouraging her to walk with her in the hallway. Zola wriggled away. She was one of those wiry, fast little kids, and she darted to the back of the classroom. The BI followed, attempted to further sort of corral her toward the doorway, but Zola continued to refuse. So the BI used a trained technique to move Zola into the hallway, while Zola did that trick where she tries to go limp and not at all move on her own 2 feet, and also tried to kick the BI in the leg or wrap her legs around the BI. Okay, so if you could type in the chat whether you think that is a moving restraint, a restraint, or an escort. We'll give think time, and then Rachel will move us to the next slide when it seems like everyone has answered. All right, you guys are good. That is in fact a moving restraint. It's a moving restraint because the BI had to use more than just a minimal amount of force, and Zola was actively, physically resisting. All right, next slide, please. We're going to talk about Xavier now. Same thing, after I present the scenario, please type into the box which type of intervention you think this is. Xavier was directed to accompany the classroom assistant to another space to process an incident in which he kicked his teacher in the shin. Xavier yelled and swore at both the teacher and the assistant and said that he wasn't going to go with her. He was staying right where he was. The assistant lowered herself to his level and reminded him that lunch was coming up soon, and patted him on the back, suggested that if he hurried that they could make it back in time for lunch. Still wasn't having anything to do with it. He told the assistant she was stupid. She's not going to make him do anything. He got up and he stomped to the door and outside in the hallway the entire time, saying, "You can't make me leave. I'm not leaving. You're stupid. Blah, blah, blah." What type? And she had her hand on his back. So what type of intervention do you think that is? All right, you guys are great. That is in fact an escort. And you know, kids are funny, aren't they? Their body will not do what their words are indicating that they will do. So yes, this is an escort. It's not governed by Rule 4500. The assistant did touch him, but minimally, and he was moving on his own volition, grumbling and muttering about it, but not physically or actively physically resisting. All right, next slide, please. We're going to go on now. We talked about escorts, restraints, and moving restraints. Now we're going to talk about seclusions, and I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this because there's a lot of confusion about what exactly is a seclusion. So a seclusion is the confinement of a student alone in a room or a space, and the student is prevented or reasonably believes that they will be prevented from leaving. It doesn't include timeout procedures, time away procedures, or private processing in which the student is not alone and is under adult supervision. So those two conditions need to be met for it to be considered a seclusion. Student needs to be alone in a space and needs to be under the impression that they are not allowed to leave until they're told that they can leave. Next slide, please. Let's talk about Willow. Willow was a tough kid. She was on a behavior plan. She was very cognitively impaired and had autism, and she engaged in a lot of self-destructive, self-injurious behaviors. So she had become quite dysregulated and was engaging in a pattern of her behaviors that involved placing sharp objects into her mouth. So her interventionist was able to extract a thumbtack from her hand, and thankfully she spit out a paperclip that she had put in her mouth. But then she started just flailing and punching herself in the head and the face. So her behavior interventionist held her in a seated position right there at her desk. He was trained to do that, and that's what he did. Meanwhile, the teacher called to have an extra person come to observe, make sure that everything was okay. So in the chat box, tell me whether you think this is a restraint or a seclusion or something else. All right. Yes, this is a cut and dry restraint. I haven't gotten into whether or not it followed the rule point by point according to what is permissible, but for now, just this alone represents a restraint. Willow was being had her arms and legs forcibly restricted from movement. So that indeed is restraint. Let's talk now about Tariq on the next slide, please. Tariq had become upset in phys ed class when his team was losing a game, and he started wildly throwing. There's a whole big one of those nets that held a bunch of balls in it, and he just was repeatedly throwing balls up toward the ceiling in an attempt to hit the lighting fixtures. So he was instructed to leave class and to visit the assistant principal's office, which he did. And after speaking briefly with him about the incident, the assistant principal informed Tariq that he was to remain seated in that office with him until the class period ended. Tariq asked if he could go sit in the front office instead, but he was told no. The assistant principal got up and closed the door and said, you know, you can go on to class when the bell rings, but for now, you just sit tight. Excuse me. And the assistant principal went about his business doing some paperwork. All right. Tell me what you think this is. Is this a seclusion? Is it a restraint? Is it something else? What's going on here? Okay, good. This is not a seclusion. You guys are correct. It may be something else. You know, if this is something that happens with Tariq often, and he's spending lots of time sitting on ice in the assistant principal's office, especially if he's on an IEP, but even if he's not on an IEP, that might be something else, but it's not a seclusion. And it's not a seclusion because he was not alone. He wasn't permitted to leave, but he wasn't alone. Next slide. Let's talk about Sadie. Sadie had eloped from the school building and was running around the playground and then into the street where there could potentially be some traffic there. Sadie was brought inside using an escort and into the quiet room. The paraprofessional accompanied her into the quiet room, hoping to process with her. Once they were inside the quiet room, Sadie became physically aggressive toward the paraprofessional. So the para stepped out of the classroom, out of the quiet room, shut the door, but remained just outside, monitoring from the window, and told her that when she was calm, she'd open the door and come in and they could talk about what had just happened. Is that a seclusion? Yep, that's a seclusion. They were inside the class. Once she was physically aggressive and she was alone in the room and prevented from leaving, that represents a seclusion. Even if she was in, well, no, I won't get there yet because I have another, I'm going to take Sadie one step further in the next slide. Let's talk about that same scenario. She'd gone outside, brought back in, paraprofessional went into the quiet room with her. She became aggressive, so the para stepped outside, but she left the door open. And she said, again, when I see that you're calm, I'll come in and we can talk. So is that a seclusion? Okay, so this one tricks up a lot of people, and it trips up a lot of professionals, not just family members. But this is still a seclusion. She was still secluded. She was alone and she wasn't allowed to leave. She didn't even have to be in a quiet room. She could have been in any room as long as she was alone and not permitted to leave. She could be in just a space, a little alcove in the hallway. There could be no door. But if she is alone and not allowed to leave, that is a seclusion. All right, next slide. Raphael. Raphael became anxious when about an unexpected change in his schedule. And Raphael's teacher suggested he take some time in the bouncy room. He was eager to do that, so he hopped, skipped, galloped out of the classroom, down the hallway, and the classroom assistant was following, couldn't quite keep up with him, but was following. And once he'd reached this room that was filled with a ball pit and a swing and bean bags and various mats, the assistant told Raph that he would be waiting out there in the hallway and to just let him know when he felt more calm and they could return to class then. Is that a seclusion or a restraint or something else? Okay, yeah. Raphael was neither secluded nor restrained. He was taking a sensory break. And although he was alone in that room, he was there by choice, and he was able to leave that space when he felt ready to do so. Next slide. Okay, here comes the phrase that you're gonna get sick of hearing me say. Imminent and substantial risk of bodily harm. That is the standard. That is the threshold by which, that's the threshold where we determine whether or not a restraint or a seclusion is allowable. So in order to restrain or seclude a student, the student needs to be imminently, meaning it's currently happening, or it has already happened and is continuing to happen, or it's about to occur at any moment now. It also means imminent also means that the child has the means to enact that harm. It means that he has in his hand that bottle that he had just been threatening to throw, and he appears to be intent on following through with that. So it also means that there's the means by which to enact harm. Substantial means considerable amount, significant. It means real, tangible. So we're talking about physical harm here. Granted, there are lots of cases where emotional, psychological harm might be inflicted, and that's absolutely not okay, but that would not warrant a restraint or a seclusion. So it means a great deal of bodily harm has happened or is likely to happen imminently. That means a physical hurt or injury that's more than minor or insignificant. It causes pain or distress, or it could interfere with health. So that's the threshold. Student needs to be immediately doing it or about to do it, has the means and the intent to do so. We can't get inside the kid's mind and really know what the intent is, but we can make professional, educated guesses. And what that child is about to do needs to be something that really can result in substantial harm or injury to himself or to someone else. Next slide. Let's talk about Paige. Given the following scenario, please type into the box whether you think Paige is posing an imminent and substantial threat of bodily harm. Paige's grandfather dropped her off at the school doorway at the beginning of the school day and explained to the principal that she'd had a rough morning. Paige was clinging to her grandfather and didn't want him to leave. He was able to extricate himself and told her that he'd be back at the end of the day to pick her up. As her grandfather walked across the parking lot and into his car, Paige bolted after him toward the car and into that flow of early morning school buses and other parents dropping off their kids. Did Paige pose an imminent threat of substantial physical injury? Yes or no? Kate, if you could just interrupt me and tell me verbally if when I'm getting to my time markers, because I'm not always looking at the chat box.
Yep, we are actually right on time. It is
Oh,
1:30 and you're right where you wanted to be.
Okay, thanks. Oh, sorry. So the answer is yes. Paige did pose an imminent and substantial risk of bodily harm. She was in the act of charging into incoming traffic. She didn't appear that she was going to stop once she hit that curb. Being struck by a car or a bus, even if it's moving at a snail's pace, which we would hope would be the case at morning drop-offs, it's still more than reasonable to believe that she could be injured by that, and that would be a severe injury that could result in pain or interfere with her health. So yes, she rose to that threshold, and hopefully there was a trained person nearby who could grab her in an approved hold and prevent her from entering traffic. Okay, let's talk about Malik. Malik was frustrated with his math assignment and was crying and pounding his hands on his desk. His teacher came over, offered help. He had reached a limit at that point, and he got up from his seat and immediately started grabbing and tearing down all the papers and posters that were on the classroom walls. And at one point he grabbed another student's piece of artwork and wadded it up in a ball and threw it, and it hit the teacher right there squarely on the side of her head, right in the temple. Did that pose an imminent threat of substantial physical harm? Yes or no? All right, great. No imminent threat of substantial harm there. He was in the act. He was throwing. He did make contact and hit a teacher, but the likelihood of being hit on the side of your head by a paper ball is not likely to cause pain or injury. Possibly if it hit her in the face and struck her eye and scratched her cornea, but no. You know, getting hit right here by a paper ball isn't going to cause a lot of harm. So no, that would not warrant a restraint or a seclusion. Next slide, please. Now you're going to learn about Laylah. She's a piece of work. All right, Laylah was in 6th period history class. By the way, these are all like figments of my imagination. I'm just acting like I know these kids. They're just, none of these are real cases. It's 6th period English class. Laylah had gotten into an argument with a girl that was seated at her table. The argument escalated and Laylah started yelling and using really, really vulgar terms, as well as racial epithets toward that peer. The teacher tried to intervene, tried to appeal to Laylah. The teacher had a pretty good relationship with her, but Laylah was worked up and just continued making those hurtful comments. So the teacher called the planning room and asked for help. Once the planning room staff member arrived, Laylah kind of transferred her anxiousness, her anger onto that person, onto that staff member. She refused to leave her seat. She told him she was not going to go to the planning room with him, and she threatened to break his nose. She had a fist cocked. She was going to punch him in the nose, and furthermore, she was going to get her boyfriend's car and she was going to run him down. She knew what his car was. She even knew his license plate, and by gosh, she was gonna hunt him down using her boyfriend's charger, and she was going to run him over. She didn't even care if his kid was in the car seat in the back seat. Now, was Laylah exhibiting imminent threat of substantial harm? All right, you guys are good. She did not have the means. I mean, she had a raised fist, but she was sitting there for a good long time, did not appear intent on socking him in the nose. Now, had she gotten out of her seat and come toward him, then maybe that would have been another story. But she was sitting there threatening, and clearly she didn't have a car right there in history class. Who knows if she even had a boyfriend or a boyfriend's car. So there was nothing imminent that was happening there, and nothing physically was happening. These were verbal threats, and absolutely the harassment and bullying that she was displaying to her classmate were harmful, psychologically harmful, and not okay, and did need to be dealt with, but not by restraint or seclusion. Next slide, please. Now we're going to talk about Kai. Kai had been called down to talk with the principal, who told him that he would not be able to play in Friday's football games due to failing midterm grades. He got highly agitated. He was a high school senior, big fullback on the varsity football team, big kid, really agitated. He just left the principal's office and went into this nearby conference room that thankfully was empty. Once he was in there, he just started swiping off everything that was on that table. And the principal came after him, of course, and stood there in the doorway and, you know, tried to appeal to him. But Kai was enraged at that point and picked up a big heavy chair, raised it over his head, went toward the principal and said, "If you step 1 foot in here, I'm gonna chuck this at you and you're gonna be sorry." And the principal stood his ground. And Kai was like, "I'm telling you, I'm playing in Friday night's game. That's stupid. My history teacher gave me an F and she's stupid. She doesn't know what she's talking about, blah, blah, blah." Principal stood his ground, didn't leave, but didn't progress into the room. And then Kai impulsively, unpredictably turned and hurled that chair right against the wall. The chair splintered into pieces. And then he went and he picked up every single chair in the room, threw it at that back wall. Really, really out of control, scary, big kid, fullback, 12th grader on the varsity team. Is he posing an imminent threat of substantial bodily harm? Interesting. You've all made some good points, but I'm calling no on this. He did have the chair. He did had it over his head and actually went toward the principal, but he didn't follow through. He had the means. He seemed to be intent on doing it, but he didn't take it that one step further. It hadn't been thrown at or even near the principal. It would have caused substantial injury if it had. But he didn't. He made an intentional choice at that time to turn around and throw the chairs, you know, very deliberately against the wall at the back of the room. The chairs and the wall were likely damaged, probably really expensive pieces of furniture. But at that point, he wasn't posing a threat of injury to himself or to the principal. Maybe one of the broken legs or arms could have splintered off and struck him, but I don't think that that would have caused substantial injury. So I'm calling no on that. It's a little, it could be a judgment call. And, you know, we all, as parents and as teachers, we have to make split-second decisions. So that principal was in a tricky situation. If he had, it would have been tough to say he was wrong to physically intervene with Kai once he started going toward him, but I would have erred on the side of caution and said that since he didn't really follow through with anything, didn't appear intent to be doing that, I'm going to say that there was no risk there. Okay, next slide. We're going to talk now about permissible interventions, and I got to talk fast. Next slide, please. We're going to talk about what is allowable. Restraints and seclusions may be used only, get this, this is new information, right? Only if the child is posing an imminent and substantial risk of bodily harm. Only as a last resort after an array of other less restrictive strategies have already been used but had failed to keep safety. So you can't just restrain a kid as your first resort. It's a last resort after you've used just about every trick in your toolbox. Only by staff who've been trained and are currently certified in a state-approved training program. Next slide. Also, only when the child is monitored throughout the entire intervention by a staff member. Only when there's no known developmental, medical, psychological contraindication toward their use. And that would have been determined in a team meeting called by a parent, school nurse, pediatrician, whatever. It would have been a team decision. Only when used in a manner that's safe, proportionate to, and sensitive to the child's severity of behavior and other things like their cognitive, developmental age, chronicle or developmental age, physical size, their ability to communicate, cognitive ability, and their known history of any trauma. Next slide. In terms of restraint, restraint is everything that we just talked about. If you do all those, it's still permissible. But here, when we talk about monitoring the child, you need to be face-to-face monitoring the child. You need to be able to see if their lips are turning blue, if they're getting not flush in the face, because you would probably be flush in the face if you're angry, but if you actually start getting white patches in your cheeks, that would be a warning sign. Or if there's visible signs of struggling to breathe or speak, that's why it needs to be face to face. And sometimes it's disturbing when people see, it's disturbing anyway to see a kid being restrained, but then to see another adult sitting there watching it, that's, you know, that's uncomfortable, but it's necessary. And then remember what we said about prone and supine restraints. They are only, those aren't allowed unless it's that 12th grade fullback and meek little person that might not be able to physically hold them strength-wise, and it would be done by more than one person. Okay, next slide. Talking about the permissible use of seclusion, again, everything that we mentioned, Also only to be used as a temporary intervention, meaning the seclusion ends, and I should say the restraint ends as well, as soon as the child demonstrates that they're no longer being an imminent substantial physical harm. That is when it stops. It doesn't stop at some predetermined time. It's only temporary. Seclusion has to be in a space that's large enough to permit safe movement, needs to be adequately lit, heated, ventilated, free of sharp or otherwise dangerous objects, and it needs to meet all fire and safety codes. And only when physical restraint is contraindicated. Next slide. Okay, let's stop.
It is, just as a heads up, it is 1:45.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to talk fast, folks. I'm sorry. So this trips people up, and this is counterintuitive to a lot of people, but only when physical intervention is contraindicated may you use a seclusion. Next slide. In other words, seclusion is only permitted when physical restraint has been determined not suitable, not advisable for this child. Restraint is considered the less restrictive and the preferable emergency intervention. That is counterintuitive to a lot of people. I can assure you that the writers of this rule, with lots of public comment from parents, teachers, advocates, DCF workers, psychologists, pediatricians, you know, it was determined that physical intervention is the preferable intervention. So seclusion is actually prohibited in Vermont unless it's been deemed to be contraindicated, or unless you have tried to restrain the student and it's not working. The kid is still able to break free, or maybe is pounding their head on the wall. Well, you wouldn't seclude a kid who's pounding their head on the wall, but anyway. So there might be and there are some very valid reasons when a child's team might determine that a restraint is contraindicated. That would be a team decision, and it would be based on factors that are medical, psychological, history of trauma, or it could be based on data and lived experience. Let's be real. If a kid is being restrained time and time again, it's probably not working. If a kid is being restrained and that only further escalates him, that's not working either. So a team might choose to make a database decision and say, let's try seclusion and see if that's more effective. So there are reasons why you may choose seclusion over restraint, but as a rule, restraint is first. All right, next slide. Let's go back to Zola. Zola is the girl whose BI used a moving restraint to get her out into the hallway. And then I didn't tell you back then what happened, but what happened is once they got into the hallway, Zola began punching and kicking the BI, and the BI was pretty skilled and used a lot of de-escalation techniques, offered a lot of calming strategies, a lot of choices, but Zola was pretty out of control at that time and was kicking, punching, trying to bite. So the BI felt like she had exhausted all means, and she placed Zola on the floor and used an approved restraint that she'd been trained on, and held her there until she showed a calm body. Now, was the BI permitted to use that intervention then and there? All right. So see, I'm trying to trick you up a little bit here. This is actually not permissible because remember what we said about prone restraints. That a prone restraint, putting Zola on the floor on her stomach, is the most restrictive type of intervention, physical intervention that we have. And it should only be used if she had first tried a seated or a standing restraint. Only prone is a last resort, and only then if the seated or standing restraint hadn't been effective. All right, next
Okay,
slide.
Tracy.
Yeah.
So we are at 150, and as I had said at the beginning, we anticipated this might run beyond 2.
Yeah.
We realized that folks might have to get off at 2, and Tracy wanted to go ahead and leave these few minutes before 2 to answer any questions that people might have. I haven't seen any questions in chat. I will just, we got a question before the workshop, so I'll go ahead and read that to Tracy. But I think if Rachel can unmute, then we'll leave it open so people can talk. If somehow that doesn't work or people don't want to talk, they can go ahead and type a question in chat and Tracy can see it or I can read it for Tracy. So anyway, the question that we have, Tracy, that has come out is, when the behavioral plan does not work and you've tried all other resources, where do you go?
Okay, that's an excellent question. I get asked that question by a lot of teachers, therapists, social workers, administrators, and it's tricky and it happens. But let me say this. Restraint and seclusion should never be written into a child's behavior plan. Restraint and seclusion are emergency interventions. They're not planful interventions. Now, some students who have a history of repeatedly being aggressive, they may have a crisis plan. Their team, a multidisciplinary team may meet and they may write up an individualized crisis plan that would be used in those cases. But I advise people not to put behavior intervention plans into the IEP. The behavior plan can be referenced, but no, sorry, I misspoke there. Restraint and seclusion should not be part of a behavior support plan. The behavior support plan should end at the point at which the student has been aggressive, imminently posing a risk of substantial harm. All the other things have been tried and failed. Then you've got an emergency on your hand. And then what you say is, we as a school abide by Rule 4500, and if we have to in these emergency situations, we'll use Jordan's individualized crisis plan that says that restraint is contraindicated or not. But by putting it into a behavior intervention plan, you're implying that you're going to plan maybe to put your hands on this kid or to seclude him. So I advise against that. I'm not a lawyer, but I advise against that. Now, let me just say there is a loophole. There's a loophole in the rule that I won't read to you, but it does allow you to do that, but only in rare instances where you have documentation of this being a pattern of behavior. And even then, literally the rule states conditions A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, all the way to L. That many restrictions and regulations would govern the use of planfully using restraint or seclusion with a student. And those conditions would be hard to meet by most schools, not impossible, but this kid would have to have a very well-rounded team that was on top of data, functional behavioral assessments, BCBA guided, things like that. So
Tracy, the question we have here, you can probably see it too, but I'll read it. If the school says to let them restrain the child or they will call the police instead, what can a parent do? So for example, a student with a trauma background who cannot be restrained due to the trauma history, that the only other choice that's given is calling the police.
Yeah. Sadly, I think a school's hands are tied just like a family's hands would be tied. If I'm home with my son and he gets out of control and I'm not trained to restrain him, or he has a trauma background that would say that I shouldn't restrain or seclude him, but if he is posing an imminent risk of substantially harming his little sister, I may have no other choice but to call the police. And yes, that can be traumatic too, but that's a tough situation. And if a child's team has determined that seclusion and restraint are contraindicated, you can't go against that. And in that case, a school has no choice other than to call people who can maintain safety.
And do we actually know, Tracy, how well the police do that when they might be called in?
Yeah, it varies across the state. I used to work in a residential, in a school affiliated with a residential program in the heart of Burlington, and Burlington police officers had bigger fish to fry and oftentimes wouldn't even come unless it was very severe. Some places are in rural Vermont and it's only state police and it could take them a half hour to get there. So it's not a perfect system. And families find themselves in this position too. It's not just schools. Again, I live in rural Vermont. If my kid is like what I had just said, posing an imminent threat to his sister, I'm going to have to wait for the state police to arrive there at my home. So it's not perfect. And absolutely, if the kid has past trauma involving the incarceration of their parents or anything related to police, that can be traumatizing too.
Tracy, where is the definition of imminent risk of harm?
Seriously?
Yeah, is there a specific definition that's used, in schools where discipline is being looked at?
Yeah, imminent means it's about to happen, it already has happened, or it's already happened and it's continuing. So it's imminent, it's real, it's happening. The kid has the means to enact it and it's going to happen. And then harm, as we are talking about it for Rule 4500, means physical harm, not emotional harm. Yeah.
So it is specifically defined in Rule 4500 was basically what I was asking, where it was. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, the rule doesn't break it down like I just did, but the rule just says imminent threat of physical harm, substantial physical harm. But that is, that's it. I mean, we're not going to restrain kids if they throw paper balls at us. We're not going to restrain Laylahs that are sitting there threatening to run down with an imaginary boyfriend's imaginary car.
Do folks have any other questions for Tracy now? We are at 2, so we can continue with the rest of Tracy's presentation. And again, we understand if people need to hop off, you'll hop off. but we do tape, we will tape Tracy's, the entire workshop, and put it on our YouTube station, and all of you will get that link. So are there any other questions? If not, we'll probably pull the slides back up and let Tracy continue. Okay, so when do we go? Okay, yes, I see there are no other questions, so we'll go ahead.
Okay. So we were on to Xavier. Let me just get my notes here. Okay, so giving the following scenario, once again, type in the chat box whether you think that this intervention with Xavier was permissible. You might remember that Xavier was the kid who threw the metal water bottle at his teacher's head and then exited the classroom stomping, but on his own volition. Once he was in the hallway, the assistant directed Xavier to go directly to the quiet room, and he was secluded there for 10 minutes. He had, he had really whacked the teacher with a heavy filled water bottle. She was holding it together and still teaching class, but she had a big goose egg on her forehead. So would it be permissible what the assistant just did? Rachel, whenever you think it's appropriate to, yeah. So no, this is not permissible. We weren't given any further information about at the time about whether he was posing an imminent threat of substantial harm once he was out of the classroom and into the hallway. He did leave class on his own volition once he'd thrown that bottle. But even if he was still showing physical aggressive behaviors then in the hallway, the assistant didn't attempt any other strategies to de-escalate him. She just told him to go to the quiet room. We don't have any knowledge about restraint being contraindicated, so seclusion in this case would not be permissible. Restraint would have been the preferred intervention, but even then, you know, his behavior, we don't think has risen to that threshold, and the interventionist has not tried other techniques to calm him. And then even if all those things had been met, and even if restraint was contraindicated, even then, seclusion, remember, is a temporary intervention, meaning that it should end as soon as he's no longer posing an imminent risk of substantial harm. So predetermined stay there for 10 minutes, some arbitrary number of minutes, are not to be used for seclusions. All right, next slide. Let's revisit Willow. Willow's the girl who places dangerous objects into her mouth and then began hitting herself forcefully in the head and face and was restrained. So yeah, the behavior interventionist followed her plan, which said, you know, in these cases, restrain. A second interventionist or second staff member was called to observe face to face. Yeah, followed the plan, using all the interventions that her plan called for, but they were not being effective. So right then and there, she was restrained by a properly trained person. Is that permissible? So yeah, this one was allowable. She was actively engaging in behaviors that could have caused her great harm. And the interventionist, as I mentioned, had used other techniques per her behavior plan. I'm going to say that the behavior plan stopped short of saying, you know, writing into the plan that you're going to restrain the kid. But at that point, she was still posing imminent threat of substantial harm to herself. So it would be permissible for the trained interventionist to restrain her then and to have a second adult on hand to observe. Next slide. Now we're going to talk about prohibited interventions. This is what is not allowed. You are not allowed to use mechanical or chemical restraints in the state of Vermont schools. We are not in the business of tying kids up or duct taping them to chairs. We aren't in the business of giving them tranquilizers. Excuse me. Those forms of restraint are not allowed in Vermont schools. Excuse me. Any intervention that restricts or limits breathing is not allowed. Remember, we said that prone and supine restraints aren't allowed unless it's absolutely necessary. So maybe that would be the case, but if a student is showing signs of struggling to breathe, then you, whether or not he's safe, you let go, because it's better to risk being hurt than it is to have him die of asphyxia. No intervention that is deliberately intended to cause pain. Any intervention that is used without maintaining direct visual contact. Not allowed to restrain or seclude for convenience of staff. Next slide. Not as a substitute for an educational program or for inadequate staff or training. Not to be used as a form of discipline or punishment or consequence. That's where I want to say in the behavior plans, you cannot say that you're going to restrain or seclude as a consequence for behavior. That implies that you have thought this through and you're using it in a punitive manner. Yes, it's aversive, but we're not using it in a way to be part of a disciplinary plan. It's for safety only. Not allowed to use these techniques in response to students' use of disrespect, refusal, vulgarity, anything, disruption, not any of those things. Only imminent risk of substantial bodily harm. Excuse me. And even then, not without the means to carry through on the threats. Excuse me. Next slide. We're going to revisit Malik. Malik had thrown the paper ball at his teacher's side of her head. He had an individual behavior plan though, and his plan involved the use of timeouts if he didn't respond to prompts and cues. So per his behavior plan, Malik had already been given several of the predetermined prompts and cues. He had been offered an alternative math assignment. And his team had met earlier in the year and determined that due to his past history of trauma, that physical restraint was contraindicated. So per his plan, he was escorted to an alcove in the hallway adjacent to the classroom. The teacher, so he was brought there. The teacher returned to class after she told him to just stay put until she could come out and speak with him again. So is that allowable? So the answer is that no, this is a prohibited intervention because this isn't a timeout. A timeout is when you are still monitored or supervised by an adult. So this is a seclusion. He wasn't in a room with a door. He was in a little alcove, but he was alone and he was told to stay there until the teacher came back out. Could he leave? Sure, he could, but he had good reason to believe that if he did, he might, I don't know, lose recess or have a detention or something. So, you know, there was a direction, stay put until I come back. So that was a seclusion. Seclusion is an emergency intervention only used when student poses imminent threat of substantial harm. We had already talked about how hitting the teacher with a paper ball doesn't meet that threshold. So, and then even with restraint being contraindicated, he didn't meet the threshold. So that is not allowed. Next slide. And our last scenario is about Laylah again. So Laylah's the one who was in history class, had the argument with her peer. Planning room staff member arrived. She redirected her anger toward him, threatening to break his nose, run him down with the boyfriend's car. She was escorted eventually to the planning room. She did go on her own volition, and she sat calmly in a chair with the staff member. Calmly meaning her body was calm. Nothing about Laylah is calm in terms of verbal stuff, and she was still worked up. So she was sitting there talking with the person, reached casually into her backpack, extracted a set of keys, dangled them in front of him, and told the planning room staff that he better be scared because at the end of the school day, she was going to wait for him to exit the building and then run him over. So at that point, the planning room teacher restrained her until she was willing to hand over the keys. Is this allowable or not? All right, so no, this is not allowed. There was no imminent threat. She didn't seem intent on causing harm in the moment. She was dangling those keys. I suppose she could have jabbed one into his eye, but she wasn't showing any intent toward doing that. They were nowhere near the parking lot. The school day had not ended, so there wasn't anything imminently happening. So no physical intervention in that case is allowed. All right, we're going to move on to the more drier parts of the law, but still important. So let's talk about evaluation and monitoring. Next slide. Per Vermont rule, following any restraint or seclusion, the child should receive a physical assessment by an adult that wasn't involved in the intervention. And I think they say that because they don't want someone who may have a conflict of interest. The purpose of this evaluation is to check and document any injury that may have been sustained as a result of that. And so the reason that they want somebody else to do that assessment is just to eliminate any shadow of a doubt about, conflict of interest. So the purpose is just to check body parts, check in with the kid, see if there's any injuries, offer ice or Band-Aids or whatever. Certainly if there's more than that type of injury, there would be further action. But any noted signs of injury would be reported to the parent or guardian as soon as possible when they're contacted before the end of the school day and told about the intervention. And then it's written into the rule that the child be monitored for the rest of the day, meaning keeping a close eye on him to see if there may be some delayed response to what happened. Remember, these can be traumatizing interventions. We're not saying that these are good interventions to be using. I'm passionate about Rule 4500, not because I like to restrain and seclude, but because I like it to be done in the proper manner. So, not going to sugarcoat it. These are dangerous, traumatic things that we're talking about. So, you're going to keep a close eye on that child for the rest of the school day. That's all that is. And the school is required to document that, yes, they did receive that evaluation by someone not involved, and yes, they were monitored by the end of the day. Sometimes the student refuses to be evaluated, and in those cases, it's not forced upon them. They don't want to prompt another outburst. So they would just call the parent or guardian and tell them and ask them to look the kid over. All right, next slide. We're going to talk about debriefing. So next slide is that debriefing should happen with the student within 2 school days of the intervention, and it should be done in a manner that's developmentally appropriate and is going to have meaning. The reason we say 2 school days, obviously the sooner after the intervention, the better, but you don't want to have that conversation when the kid is still charged up and still, not fully regulated. You might want to talk about it the next day or possibly two school days later, just to give time for it to just be calm. But the purpose is to discuss what behaviors led up to the interventions and to see, to make sure that the child knows why he was restrained and to address any concerns that he has. And, it's not written into the rule, but I think that another purpose of debriefing is to just try to restore that relationship, try to restore the child's trust and faith that we were only acting with the best of intentions. We didn't like doing this to you, so on and so forth. So it's important that you debrief with the child, always, always. And again, that needs to be documented by the school. Next slide. Debriefing needs to happen with the staff members who were involved in the restraint or seclusion. Again, within 2 school days, the sooner the better, but sometimes there are IEP meetings or faculty meetings after school, so it might, you're given a window of 2 school days. But the purpose is to discuss whether proper procedures were followed, including those procedures that were used to prevent the need for restraint or seclusion. And if this is a student who's showing a pattern, or a staff member for that matter, if a pattern emerges, then a team meeting may be advised to review the student's plan or to develop a plan if one isn't already in existence, and then to consider any changes to better support the child. So that is the debriefing with the staff members involved. Next slide. Debriefing is offered to parents and guardians within 4 school days. Again, sooner the better, but the point being that it may be just more logistics involved in scheduling a date and a time, but the parent must be given an opportunity to participate in a review of the incident, and they have to be given prior written notice about it. The meeting needs to be held at a mutually agreeable time and place. And the purpose is to determine with the parents or guardians any follow-up actions that should be taken. Okay, next slide. Reporting. Next slide. So anytime I think you went one slide too far. Yeah. Reporting to the school administrator. Anytime an individual staff member restrains or secludes a child, they should notify the school administrator as soon as possible, and in no circumstances any later than the end of that school day. And then for the parents, the school administrator or a designee must make a documented attempt to give verbal or electronic notice to the parent or guardian as soon as possible. And again, no later than by the end of that school day. In addition to that verbal or email notice, written notice has to be sent to the parents or guardians within 24 hours of any restraint or seclusion. And that written notice needs to include also the date and time that the staff would be debriefing and an invitation to attend that debriefing, or an invitation to, if that time doesn't work for them, to schedule a separate debriefing that would involve the team, and they would look at it and determine if follow-up actions were necessary. That written notice should also include the name and number of a person who can provide further information for the parent or guardian. Next slide. Reports are required to be sent to the superintendent of the schools within 3 days if any of the following have occurred. And I won't read these to you, but just any of these circumstances would necessitate the building administrator to provide a written report to the superintendent within 3 school days. And that's checks and balances to make sure that these things are documented. They do become part of a student's file, and that there's a system of checks and balances. Not going to say that staff members will face disciplinary actions if they've done more than, what does it say, secluded a student more than 3 times. There may be an interventionist who has a kid who that was just necessary more than 3 times. So we're not saying that the person would face disciplinary action, but it's raising a red flag to the superintendent. Okay. And then lastly, next slide, written reports need to come to the secretary of the Agency of Education within 3 school days of the superintendent's receipt of the report, if there was an injury or a death that required outside medical attention, if the intervention lasted for more than 30 minutes, or if the intervention was used in violation of the rules. So those reports need to be addressed to the secretary. They come into his office, and then they are sent to Kate and myself. We review every single restraint and seclusion report with a fine-tooth comb. We follow up with the district, and we keep a database of that information. Now, restraints and seclusions that don't meet these 3 criteria still become part of the student's file, and they're also entered into what's called, oh God, what's it called? Kate, what's CIRS called? I'm forgetting the acronym. Combined Incident Reporting System. That's a system where all schools are required to enter into a database any sort of disciplinary actions that have occurred. Not that restraint and seclusion is a disciplinary action. It's not. It's an emergency intervention. But any behaviors that gave rise to the need for that are documented. Bullying, hazing, harassment, all of those sorts of things. Any seclusions or any suspensions or expulsions. So those also go into a database. We don't review those except in certain circumstances, but that data is collected and certain parts of that database are extracted for federal reporting. And that ends the formal presentation. We already had questions, but I want to leave the floor open if there are any additional questions. Just give you some think time, but I also wanted to mention that you've got my and Kate's contact information there. Kate, I forgot to ask you, but for me, email is the absolute best way to reach me. Is that the case for you too, Kate?
Yes, definitely.
Okay. So yeah, any more
Awesome.
questions?
Well, thank you, Tracy. I'm taking a look at the chat. I think we have lost quite a few people, but thank you to all of you who have stayed beyond the 2 o'clock to learn this information. We do have a link to our evaluation in our chat, so it would be great if you would fill it out. We do need those for grant purposes. So as Tracy said, she and Kate are available when professionals or families have questions, and we at VFN too. We would welcome your questions about this topic as well. Check out our website for everything that's available for families and professionals. So thank you again, everyone, and have a good day.
Thank you.